thank you so much for joining. So this event, our roundtable on eco-anxiety, is basically a collaboration between SSC, the Student Sustainability Commission at ETH, and Mowat, the mental well-being community, based at the universities in Zurich. So Mowat is also a student organization, and our focus is on mental health in academia. And what we basically want to achieve is to raise more awareness and get a conversation going around mental health, because it's such an important topic, and it affects so many people, especially younger people, students. Yeah.
And as Tiam said, it's a collaboration. So I'm from SSC, the Student Sustainability Commission of ETH, which basically works on a wide range of topics. So from divestment to making the food we eat more sustainable, to just organizing events like this one. So I'm gonna share my screen. So I'm gonna quickly go over our panelists, and then they can tell us a few words about who they are. So we first have Anja. She's an independent policy analyst and communications expert on climate mitigation policies. She's also a performer and a visual artist. We have Samira. She's an environmental engineering student at ETH. She's also responsible for public relations for the NGO Green Academy Africa. And we also have Brigitta, who's a counselor and psychotherapist, active member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. So stop sharing. Maybe our panelists, do you want to say a few words about yourself, add to the very brief short description I just said?
Okay, shall I start? Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm calling in from London. I've been a psychotherapist for about 20 years. I have a special interest in how the psychotherapeutic profession responds to the mental health issues that are created by the climate crisis. And I'm also, as Julia said, I'm an active member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, in particular climate cafes. So I run an average of 1 climate cafe a month, and perhaps Julia will leave you with some details. You're very, very welcome to attend a climate cafe. They're very affordable and highly rewarding. I think that's probably enough for me. So I'm really pleased to share this space with you.
Thank you. We're really happy to have you here.
I'll go next. I hope you can hear me. My internet is not so good, despite being right in the center of Zurich. I've worked as a climate policy analyst for over 2 decades. I originally studied climate policy and psychology, so I've always been interested in, what makes us care, and also how do we deal with the crises we are facing. About 15 years ago, I worked with a bunch of researchers on climate policy, and we had regular gatherings we called depressing dinners, where we just got together and kind of shared our feelings. We cooked together, we ate together, we shared some poetry, or we just talked, and it was really meant to be a space, to express those feelings we, in our daily work, we cannot always have in the forefront. So I'm very interested in this question: how do we deal with this crisis? How do we deal with these intense feelings without having them stifle our actions and our effectiveness? And so I've thought a lot about this. Also, I thought a lot about the role of denial, I believe that denial is a very important coping mechanism we have, and if we use it conscientiously and in the right way, it actually helps us, with other things to really keep going and just keep doing the work we need to do, no matter what. And I think that's enough. I spent a long time in the US, and then first I worked on the UN level, then I worked on the European level, then I came back to Switzerland. I worked on Swiss politics, not very effectively since we voted down our climate law. And now I actually, in 2018, I decided to change careers and I became a grade school teacher. So now I do kind of both things. I'm a grade school teacher and a climate policy expert. And it's a nice combination.
Thank you, Anja. Okay, so now that you know our panelists, I thought that a cool first step would be to maybe collectively construct a definition of eco-anxiety. So Tiam will send in the chat a link where you can just answer the question, what is eco-anxiety about for you? It's anonymous. You can just type in words that pop to your mind when you hear eco-anxiety, and we'll just go over the results briefly. Okay, so maybe Brigitta, do you want to go over some words that popped up?
Yeah, definitely. I can see that a lot of the words actually fit the description. I mean, eco-anxiety is a sort of a term that encompasses lots of different feelings. It's not just the anxiety, but it's also, we can see helplessness, hopelessness, fear, loneliness. In CPA, we actually sort of moved away from using the term eco-anxiety, and we are talking about eco-distress, because of the very fact that eco-distress encapsulates a range of feelings, including anger, rage. I'm not sure whether I can see anger on the word cloud. That's a very, very important one. And I'm sure you have heard our friend Greta Thunberg expressing her anger. Anger is, so basically, it's important to sort of encompass a whole range of feelings, so that so it's not just an anxious state. And as Anja alluded to earlier, denial is also could be a way of coping with eco-anxiety or eco-distress. The term first appeared in 1990 in America in response to a polluted lake, and it was actually reported as eco-anxiety the first time. I think this is probably, so the other thing that that we might differ from other people or other views and perspectives is that within the Climate Psychology Alliance, we consider eco-anxiety as a healthy response to what's happening. In fact, it's quite alarming when people don't feel anxious, at least some of the time. Of course, it becomes problematic and stifling if we feel too much. So in a way, we have to learn to cope with it, which we call resilience. We have to build up resilience. And that's really where activism comes in. So the anxiety leading into an action, or indeed the anger that we feel in response to the inaction on the political front. So I think that's probably as much as I want to say at this point.
Okay, thank you so much for your insights. So you mentioned so a range of different emotions related to eco-anxiety. So I wanted to talk about the climate emotion scale, so that then everyone can sort of get situated to where they are on this scale. So I'm gonna quickly present this scale. So the first step is, it's not step, like the first state would be eutheria, which is just a positive feeling of oneness with the earth. The second one would be soliphilia, which is the love and sense of responsibility for a place. Then we have solastalgia, which is the sorrow a person feels when their natural environment is altered. Ecoanxiety would be the anxiety about the future of the environment. Then we have ecoparalysis, which would be the inability to respond to the climate crisis that society is currently facing. Eco-guilt, so the guilt one feels when they feel they could have contributed more to help the earth. Eco-grieving, the grief associated with the physical degradation of ecosystems. Tierra trauma is the sudden grief or pain a person experiences when witnessing a traumatic environmental change. And then we have eco-rage, which is the anger, usually towards the system and the people in power that continue to allow the degradation of the earth. So keeping this scale in mind, I would like to ask you to answer a poll. So where would you put yourself on this climate emotion scale? You can, of course, answer more than one stage. So now I'll stop sharing, and maybe Brigitta, do you want maybe to comment on that? A question I also wanted to ask you was, why is it important to actually have terms to coin on specific emotions?
Okay, I was just looking at the at the chart, and I was quite surprised actually that the eco-guilt is relatively low. I would have, but perhaps this is also because it's a very young audience. I certainly have eco-guilt. You know, I've really only sort of started changing my life and reduced my reduced how much I consume about 10 years ago. I'm not surprised that tierra trauma is low, because that probably would be very, very different if you lived, you know, in South Africa, for example, in 2018, when the water ran out, or you know, when the sort of the sort of extreme weather events, they would create a lot of tierra trauma. So why is it important to have all these terms? I think it's important to be able to identify what you're feeling, not just in relation to other fellow human beings, but in relation to the planet, our home, the collective home. And I mean, on a very basic level, it's important to be able to identify any emotion that you have, because it allows us to regulate our emotions. And that is really important, especially as we are moving more into a precarious state, as the planet moves into a more, in a less stable. The less stable the planet is, the more we have to really be able to be resilient and also be able to regulate our extreme emotional responses. So, you know, and of course they're all there. They're different. Like solastalgia is, you know, we feel, for example, if you stand in front of an open coal mine. In fact, that's where the term was researched by Glenn Albrecht. Most of these terms actually he discusses in his book Earth Emotions. And suddenly, when I came across solastalgia, I suddenly realized actually what I feel when I, you know, when I walk through the countryside and I pass a field that's just been sprayed with pesticides. That really evokes solastalgia in me, and quite acute. But also solophilia, in a sense, is important. You know, that we recognize the immense beauty and resourcefulness that nature gives us. The eco-grieving is really important, because it's like when we've lost the loved one, the grieving process is very important, because, and contributes to our emotional health, as Freud first pointed out in his wonderful paper, Mourning and Melancholia, in 1918. And today, sadly, we quite often, when people are grieving, very quickly they are being prescribed antidepressants rather than being supported in allowing the feelings, moving through the feelings. So naming the feelings gives us a sense of security. It holds us, recognizing, because if you imagine a young child doesn't really know what they are feeling, and it's the caregivers around the child that help a child to name the sensations, because sensations, including anxiety, are very important to be able to name, because it helps us to orient ourselves. It helps us to recognize cause and effect. Tierra trauma is going to be a big one, I think. And I actually feel that we are already collectively experiencing trauma in relation to the climate crisis. It is indeed traumatic, because our home is at risk. In some countries, of course, far more than in others. But our collective home that we share and love is under threat. And so this situation is akin to a traumatic situation. I think that's probably ecoparalysis. I think again is when we feel, perhaps when we're left on our own with the eco-anxiety, and hence this forum is so important. And you know that the climate cafes we run are very important to talk about these feelings, because it's actually really difficult to talk with friends about these feelings, because they are difficult. It's like when you are grieving, you know, people, it generally, and there's something about who we are as a species, we want to be happy, we want to be peaceful, and but of course, there's also, you know, social values that it's society that doesn't really allow us to grieve or to have the a whole range of negative, so-called negative feelings. Okay, I think that's probably, is that enough?
Maybe I'll add a couple of things that maybe to a little bit to contrast. I think these terms are useful. I think in terms of coping with your own emotions, it's useful to have simpler terms, because in the moment, the things you will feel will be anger, fear, despair. So feelings that are kind of words that we kind of viscerally understand, whereas these terms are kind of have a little bit of an academic flavor to them. And so I would very much advocate that when we talk about these eco-distress, which I, by the way, much prefer to eco-anxiety because it's much larger, I think it's very important to use words that actually emotionally connect with us. And so I would advocate for simpler words. I also would think it's not a scale, it's just different states we can find ourselves in. And I would also advocate that this love for nature is something that kind of, I would advocate for being careful to separate it from this kind of notion that came out of the romantic period, which is this love for the landscape, love. Because I think in my work, I have met people who are extremely committed to the well-being of the planet, and they are not driven by a love for nature. They are driven by a love for people. So I think this notion that everybody has to love animals and plants and being in it can be limiting. So if we really want to reach everybody, I think it's important to broaden up, but on the one hand, broaden up and make sure we realize it's complex and messy. Also in terms of broadening up in terms of who we are as an individual. So we're not optimists or pessimists. It actually is situational. There's not, and I think this is also helpful in your own work, because you can, I'm rather pessimistic overall when I look at I read a lot of climate science, and, it's a little bit hard to not be pessimistic if you're a realist. But when it comes to my work and when it comes to kind of the daily, how I cope with things, I actually think I'm a rather optimistic person. And I think it helps to frame it that way, that it's actually, it's not this question, are you optimistic or can you find optimism, kind of a state that stays permanent, but it's more, how do you move, like you said, Brigitta, how do you move through these emotions most skillfully? And they will vary greatly depending on what situation you're in. So that's what I wanted to add.
I just love the sound of this, like Tierra trauma, and and also I'm a great fan of Glenn Albrecht's work, so I'm biased.
Well, I'm sure if you work with it on a daily basis, these words become,
they come alive.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I was just loving it, to be honest, because it's so nuanced, and Tierra trauma is just something that, it's more than terror. It's sort of it really suits the time that we live in. But in the first instance, I really think it's important that we acknowledge the range of feelings, and that we actually acknowledge that we need to have these feelings. and not live in constant denial. It can be such a relief when it's allowed, when feelings are allowed.
Well, this is actually, I'll challenge you a little bit on this, because I've actually worked with lots of people who are extremely committed, but I would say emotionally they are in denial, and that's what keeps them going. So, my best friend is at the climate negotiations right now. And, when I talk with him about these things, I'm always kind of surprised by it. He doesn't, he's kind of like, he doesn't think about it so much to really despair over it. He just like does his thing. And I've come to believe that that's equally valid as a coping strategy.
Yeah, I don't think it's either or. I think it's often that climate scientists share their feelings in privacy, because I don't think it's for the public. And I think that, but it's also equally cruel if we don't feel anything at all. But I agree. I mean, I think we have, in order to function, we have to actually dissociate from what's going from our feelings in order to function. So, and dissociation is not pathological. It's actually a survival mechanism, much needed for negotiations. I would agree, definitely. But of course, I'm seeing it from a more psychotherapeutic perspective, and I think the two sort of really overlap and intersect. Yeah.
So what would you say about Greta, who's bringing back actually emotion into the room when during her speech she says, "How dare you?" when she almost or does cry, she brings back a lot of anger and sadness in her speeches.
I mean, Greta is a really interesting case study, because, Greta has, she moved from being completely shut down to being really feeling empowered and supported to speak out. I think this is really, this probably differs to a lot of young people who maybe have live in homes where they are not being supported, where they can't talk about their climate distress. Greta comes from an extremely supportive family, and I think she plays an incredibly important role. Ultimately, I mean, I personally, I am of the view that it's the young people expressing their emotions that will move politicians, because they're scared. They're scared of you.
Yeah, I would agree.
You need to actually express yourselves. I mean, if you think about what she unleashed, and how the whole agenda has moved. So I think we need many Gretas in this world, young people expressing. And Greta is actually, she understands the science.
Yeah, I would agree that for the political process, she was incredibly important. And also because she really, a movement coalesced around her. And for me, it's always the question, how do you skillfully act? How do you skillfully express your emotions if your intent is to facilitate change? So, and actually, this is a question we cannot stop asking ourselves. If you have, we have Extinction Rebellion, for example. I find with a lot of these groupings, there's a little bit this view that they have found what is the truth, and that all other groups or all the people who have come before haven't understood, and I think we will only be able to address this crisis or alleviate it to some extent if we show up in numbers. So it's not just that we have to express ourselves, we have to be many, and we can only be many if we are inclusive. So this means we have to also talk to people who believe in capitalism. I have many friends who are very much believers of capitalism, and who believe we need capitalism to facilitate the technological changes and the political changes we need. You know, I happen to be of a different opinion, but if we are not inclusive, and it's uncomfortable to be inclusive, it's really nice to have people who share your opinions. And I think that was also one of her strengths, of Greta's strengths, that she really dared to feel uncomfortable. And so, you know, for each and every one of us, I think we need to ask ourselves, okay, how can I be most skillful? How can I, you know, work towards change in the best way? And I think there's two things to look at. One is, what does that affect in the world? How does that really, can you facilitate change? You know, does it make more sense to go to a sit-in with Extinction Rebellion, or should you hand out flyers for the new energy law that is going to be voted on in 2 weeks? So, you know, it's important to really ask those questions. And then on the other hand, it's the personal question. You know, what really gives you energy despite all this negativity? What do you enjoy? I always, when people ask me, you know, what should I do? Where should I engage? I always say, you know, pick something where you get something for yourself, where you like the people, or you find the topic really interesting, because you need that. If it's only the optimism that you can facilitate or affect change, I think you will burn out rather quickly. You always have to draw on many sources of energy.
I just wanted to sort of bring it back to the sort of the emotional level, and I'm sort of mindful that you all, I believe, work in sustainability, and I guess I'm just sort of mindful that you know, especially people who work at 5 days a week or sometimes 7 days a week on the environment, that actually they also need their well-being, because I think it's this event is about our well-being. And I just wanted to sort of bring it back to our well-being, because on the one hand, yes, it's great to be an activist, but of course the danger is also that you get burned out. And that's what I have worked with a number of activists who have actually suffered from burnout. So in a way, what Anja was talking about, finding your niche, finding something that is meaningful to you, but also finding places where you can share what you're feeling.
Yeah, maybe Brigitta, you could talk to that. One of the things I found most difficult in my life, I still find most difficult, is to be confronted again and again with my helplessness, or with my smallness. Even if I devote 7 days a week for 20 years, you know, something I've done maybe not 7 days a week, but really a lot, I'm still always confronted with, you know, the little change I have been able to facilitate. So this, how to cope with helplessness, I find very challenging.
I mean, I think help. Yeah, maybe Samira, do you? Because often we don't realize when we're actually approaching a burnout, and there's something about really finding ways of regulating, you know, regulating your life. And so, you know, things like going out, seeing friends, meditation, yoga, all those things are really help us to reconnect with ourselves and what is important for you, and actually to live a life as best as you can. We can't save the world. It has to save itself.
I just read the comment that Lisa wrote, and I think that's also a very important point. In our modern society, scientists are forced to exclude values and subjective input emotions and hide their humanity altogether. And I think among climate scientists, this has somewhat changed. Like, this was my main pet peeve 25 years ago. I kept arguing with people saying, you cannot just do your science, you also have to say how you feel about it and what this does with you, and kind of stand up with what that means in terms of societal change. So I think it's actually gotten a little bit easier because we have role models. We have quite a few climate scientists. Reto Knut is one of them, who very explicitly says what this means in terms of political change, and you know, maybe he doesn't express his emotions like, but he clearly expresses his views. So I would love to hear from some other people how that is, because I assume many of you are scientists. If that's still the case, that you feel you cannot really freely talk about what the implications are of your work and how you feel about it.
This is a point to switch off the recording.